talked about this. The only issue I had, there's plenty of video content out there, me shooting fish,
Right.
But what'd you do in order to get that fish?
Right.
And you wrote that phenomenal article about everything.
Oh,
and
thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it was great. And that's what, I sent it to all my buddies, who are just getting into it. And I was like, hey, you need to read this because you broke down everything, for white sea bass. Like, to me, I knew white sea bass were out there. And before, really me and you started chasing them, like, I've never got one. I've seen them. But I was like, oh, you can just kick around, you just go swim around. Yeah. And then you're like, no, like, you need to follow the tides. There's so much more that goes into it. It's like, oh, okay.
Well, I say it's like there's a lot that goes into it to increase your probability.
Yeah.
But then again, like, just get in the water.
Right.
Yeah, because sometimes, when you say we're busy, I can't just like, hey, I know there's a softball game going on today, but it's low tide and I want to go for it. Like, just fucking go.
Right.
Yeah, And there's been times, and very quickly when you go out, if it's not fishy, it's like either move that spot or it's just going to be a long day,
right.
Yeah. Or I remember you telling me about that time you were out, talk about the tides, and you said, yeah, talk about that story.
Yeah. So that was an amazing time. Going out right before high tide hit. Viz was great that day, probably around 20 feet. And like you see these calico, sheephead. I was in shallower water headed out to the kelp. And you see these fish, so you dive down, because, sheephead and calicos, you can kind of duck dive on them. They're not just going to spook. Right.
Yeah. And, just slow.
And so I realized, like, diving down on them, as soon as they saw me, as soon as I head over heels underwater, they'd take off. I mean, instant. They'd spook, and you'd never see them again. And I was like, dang it, So I went out to the kelp, I hunted, got a couple sheephead. Then coming back in, something changed. I could tell in the environment. I'd see these fish. I'm talking about, big stud calico, over 5-6 pounds, bigger. And I was like, dang, like, I want to shoot one, on my way back in. So I was kind of in a rush. So dove down, and I literally got within 3 feet of this fish. I was like, oh, great. Boom, shot him. Put him on a stringer. As I'm sitting there on a stringer, saw another one. I was like, oh. Dove down on him. And they just sat there. I was like, these fish are just letting me kill them, Like, I'm swimming right up to these fish.
Right.
And it was just the environment changed so much. Whatever. I took a note of the time. It was right when high tide hit. Like, according to the tide chart, like, on the dot, it was like, oh, high tide's, 10:45.
Yeah.
It was 10:45. And just like that, these fish were letting me swim up to them without spooking. They were curious. They'd come up to me too. Like, not even have to hunt. Literally just duck diving down, seeing these fish, swimming up to them, shooting them. So I got about 2. Then after that, I was like, man, it's almost not sporty. Because these fish, there was no sport in it, for the most part. And I dived down, I was like, oh, that's a monster too. And I'd poke him. I'd poke at him with my gun.
Remember doing that last week? Like, are you serious? Like, I could just, okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And it was just crazy to see the change in the fish's behavior. Like I said, a total light switch.
Yeah. I've seen that before where there's like predators, other bigger predators like around, and like just looking at bait fish where they're like all nervous and they're like rushing around, and then you find out there's like a white sea bass around and there's some yellowtail, and then like you could pretty much go up to them and just poke them with your spear, and it's pretty mellow and they don't even seem to care. And I don't know, and again, I'm trying to figure this out too. Like, I'm not sure if it's in those certain situations, if it's more like there's some predators lurking, like a 7-gill or something, or a seal or sea lion, or if it's just a tidal change. Mm-hmm. And that's important. And like what you said is like, I mean, I guess I should, but I don't keep logs of all that stuff to try to figure it out and see if you notice a pattern.